We are currently on the road to Streets of Rage 5. At the Game Awards in December 2023, Sega electrified fans with a bold announcement that the Sega Power Surge, a major initiative for the company to revive several of its iconic game franchises, was coming. This exciting reveal confirmed that new titles are in development for beloved series like Jet Set Radio, Crazy Taxi, Shinobi, Golden Axe, and of course Streets of Rage. The reveal trailer teased tantalizing glimpses of these upcoming games, blending modern graphics and gameplay styles with nostalgic brands that, although thrilling, is also worrying. Known as Streets of Rage Revolution, some of us already fear this next game might stray too far from the series' roots. After all, many of us worship this franchise and appreciate its 2D aesthetics, tight side-scrolling beat-em-up gameplay, and iconic Yuzo Koshiro soundtracks. Early glimpses, on the other hand, hint that Revolution will shift towards a 3D action format and a more cinematic approach. Critics worry that such changes could dilute the essence of what made the series a classic, potentially prioritising mainstream appeal over the gritty arcade-style experience long-time fans cherish. Additionally, skepticism looms over whether the combat mechanics will maintain the depth and fluidity that made the original game so enduring. For some, Revolution represents a gamble that risks alienating the series' core audience in pursuit of modern trends, but it also raises the question of whether it can capture the franchise's heart, a balance of skill-based gameplay, atmospheric storytelling, and the raw, edgy charisma that made the originals unforgettable. Fans are left wondering if Sega can successfully evolve the series while staying true to its soul. This seems fair, as for many, the Streets of Rage series is more than just a game, it's a cultural touchstone, a masterclass in how to deliver thrilling action in a package that oozes personality. Which is why, as we get closer to the release of this new game, now is as perfect a time as ever to have a look back through history at the existence of this franchise and look at what makes it so great. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the road to Streets of Rage 5 and a fantastic legacy of one of the greatest series in gaming history. Yeah! Arcade-style beat-em-ups. What's not to love about this iconic genre? While the mid-90s saw some developers pivot away from these brawling classics, the genre is back and in full force, and we're living through a true beat-em-up renaissance, with Streets of Rage 4 functioning as one of the crown jewels of this age. What's even better is there are now so many great games like this to choose from, meaning that under usual circumstances it would cost you a pretty penny to buy all of them. Fortunately though, now's your chance to grab some of the best modern entries in the genre at unbeatable prices. Dive into the action with Double Dragon Gaiden, the critically acclaimed Streets of Rage 4, the vibrant River City Girls 2, or the nostalgic masterpiece that is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge. You can score massive discounts up to 90% off on these incredible titles and thousands more, spanning AAA hits, indie gems and retro throwbacks from a range of genres. Support my channel and snag these deals by clicking the affiliate links in my pinned comments. It's a win-win, great games at amazing prices and more content for you to enjoy. Don't miss out and happy shopping. The year is 1990 and the gaming world is on the brink of a revolution, the dawn of a 16-bit console wars. Sega's Mega Drive, first launched in Japan in 1988, is still finding its footing. At this point, Sega is far from dominating and their new console is being outsold by both the Nintendo Famicom and even the PC Engine, firmly placing Sega in third place in the Japanese market. But while the situation was far from ideal, Sega's uphill battle was about to get even steeper, as it was 1990 that marked the debut of the Super Famicom, Nintendo's own 16-bit powerhouse, turning up the pressure in what would soon become an all-out war for console supremacy. Sega needed to step up, and fast, so the race was on to develop attention-grabbing software that would swing the console wars in Sega's favour. In the early days of the Super Nintendo, you might recall the release of a home port of Final Fight, an exciting prospect for everyone who had enjoyed this game in the arcades. In fact, this arcade brawler was crowned Game of the Year in 1989, functioning as a beautiful technical marvel for its time. Final Fight was special and built on everything that the cooperative beat-em-up genre pioneered by Technosoft Japan's Double Dragon prior. In fact, a case could be made that Final Fight set a new standard in beat-em-ups, refining the formula and earning its well-deserved place as one of the greatest arcade games ever made. This meant that securing Final Fight for the Super Nintendo was a major victory for Nintendo, which in turn meant bad news for Sega. While allegedly Streets of Rage was never made in direct response to Final Fight's Nintendo exclusivity console deal, Noriyoshi Oba, the man who would direct Streets of Rage, claims he wanted to make what he called a street karate game for Sega's 16-bit platform before hearing news of Nintendo's Final Fight deal. For evidence of this, in one interview he states, "After the development of the Super Shinobi was complete, I discussed with Yuzo Koshiro some ideas for making a street karate game. We looked at titles such as Double Dragon and Final Fight, and used detective TV shows like Starsky and Hutch and The A-Team for reference. Then we proceeded to create the concept for Bear Knuckaroo." But elsewhere, he has gone on record to admit that in the production of Streets of Rage, they would study Final Fight extensively. Before it became the legendary Streets of Rage, the game began life under the intriguing working title of D-SWAT, with the D standing for Dragon. Early development sketches painted a very different picture, featuring a bold cast of characters far different from the ones we would go on to know and love. But as the game evolved, so did its heroes. These early concepts were transformed into the now iconic trio of Blaze, Fielden and Company, establishing the identity we all know today. Speaking of the concept evolving, even the name underwent a transformation. In Japan, the gritty action-packed brawler was rebranded as Bear Knuckaroo, signalling the raw, hard-hitting nature of the battles to come. The stage was set for Streets of Rage to storm its way into gaming history, and it did so with a bang. While Final Fight for the Super Nintendo turned out to be something of a disappointment, hampered by technical limitations that forced it into being a single-player only experience, along with significant cuts to arcade content, Sega with Streets of Rage delivered the opposite. The game not only contained the core features that made arcade beat-em-ups so enjoyable, but it also showcased some of the potential that the Sega Mega Drive had. Unlike with Super Nintendo's Final Fight, where the feature would need to be dropped, Sega's decision to prioritise cooperative gameplay paid off massively. Streets of Rage wasn't just a game, it was an experience that encouraged camaraderie and replayability. Players were drawn in by its gritty urban environments, memorable characters like Axel, Blaze and Adam, and a combat system that felt intuitive yet rewarding. So let's touch more on what made this great game possible. As already mentioned, Sega had already been paying close attention to what Capcom were doing with Final Fight. But the company were no stranger to the beat-em-up genre, having already found success with the now legendary Golden Axe. Released in arcades in 1989, the same year as Final Fight, Golden Axe quickly made its way to the Sega Mega Drive, where its home console debut was notably smoother than Final Fight's. The Mega Drive version of Golden Axe was highly faithful to the arcade original, retaining all of the crucial two-player cooperative features, which, as mentioned earlier, are a cornerstone of the genre. Golden Axe obviously is stylistically worlds apart from Final Fight's urban street brawling aesthetic, which many considered cooler and more modern. But that didn't mean Sega couldn't re-utilise its already created engine to make a new beat-em-up featuring a different art style. Essentially, the existence of Golden Axe meant that Sega could create its own Final Fight style game with cooperative play fully intact on a home console, as they already successfully produced a cooperative beat-em-up previously for the system. Noriyoshi Oba of Team Shinobi, who has already had a mention today, would alongside his team be tasked with developing the game. Known for his work on Revenge of Shinobi and as a planner on Wonder Boy in Monsterland, using the Golden Axe engine, the game was designed specifically for the Sega Mega Drive. Oba's leadership extended to overseeing the development of key elements such as the game's combat mechanics, cooperative gameplay features, and overall presentation. He worked closely with other team members, including composer Yuzo Koshiro, to craft a cohesive experience that blended gritty, urban aesthetics with satisfying gameplay and a memorable soundtrack. His direction ensured that Streets of Rage became a defining title for the console and a classic in the beat-em-up genre. Oh, and speaking of Koshiro, how can we talk about the first Streets of Rage game without this man? The music was composed by Yuzo with the additional contributions of Motohiro Kawashima. Yuzo Koshiro is renowned for his innovative and groundbreaking work in video game music, and his compositions for Streets of Rage are widely regarded as some of the best in gaming history. Koshiro's soundtrack was heavily influenced by the house, techno and electronic music scenes of the late 80s and early 90s, drawing inspiration from artists like Kraftwerk and genres like Detroit techno. Using the Sega Mega Drive's Yamaha YM2612 sound chip, Koshiro crafted a dynamic and energetic soundtrack that perfectly complemented the game's gritty urban atmosphere. His music not only enhanced the gameplay experience but also helped establish the identity of the Streets of Rage series, making it as much about the vibe and style as the gameplay itself. Tracks like Fighting in the Street and The Last Soul remain iconic, and the Streets of Rage soundtrack is still celebrated for its influence and creativity. Oh yeah, and did I mention Yuzo's sister, Ayano Koshiro, also worked on this game. In fact, she designed the game's iconic characters, including Axel, Blaze and Adam, helping define the visual appeal of the game's heroes. A small team of artists contributed to the game's gritty urban environments, which played a major role in the game's immersive aesthetics. Speaking of aesthetics of Streets of Rage, they were heavily influenced by the 1984 cult classic film Streets of Fire. This influence is evident in the game's visual style, character designs and overall tone. The movie Streets of Fire is set in a gritty, neon-lit urban environment that blends 1950s noir with 1980s punk and rock aesthetics. This unique, retro-futuristic cityscape directly inspired the look and feel of Streets of Rage. The game's stages, such as rain-soaked streets, industrial zones and back alleys, mirror the film's urban decay and atmospheric lighting, creating a sense of danger and excitement. In essence, Streets of Rage distilled the essence of Streets of Fire into a playable format, blending its neon-soaked visuals, rebellious characters and urban grit with Sega's distinct gameplay style. Sega's in-house testing and marketing teams ensured the game ran smoothly on the Mega Drive hardware and successfully reached its audience. The collaboration between these creative and technical experts resulted in a game that became a cornerstone of the beat-em-up genre. The game kicks off with a cinematic flair, featuring a Star Wars-style scrolling text that lays out the premise of a story. Set against the backdrop of a cityscape with towering skyscrapers slowly panning across the screen, this opening sequence immediately sets the tone and establishes the gritty urban setting. As you read through the text, you'll notice striking similarities to Final Fight. The city has fallen under the grip of a ruthless crime syndicate, but this time you're not playing as ex-wrestlers or mayors. You're a group of young police officers who have sworn to take back the streets, even at the cost of their own lives. The opening line, declaring their willingness to risk anything to achieve this, even their lives, sets the stakes high right from the start. From the moment you pick up the controller, the inspiration from genre classics like Golden Axe and Final Fight is unmistakable. Much like Golden Axe, released just 2 years earlier, you fight your way through waves of enemies that attack from both sides, and sometimes from unexpected directions. The gameplay sticks to the tried and true beat-em-up formula that had dominated arcades, but Streets of Rage refines it with its own unique flair. The game's visuals and gameplay style bear a clear resemblance to Final Fight, fulfilling Sega's goal of creating a home console rival to Capcom's arcade hit. But where Final Fight was limited in its transition to the Super Nintendo, Streets of Rage shines, bringing the full arcade experience into your living room. The game begins by prompting you to choose from 3 characters, each with their own distinct strengths and weaknesses. These aren't just faceless heroes, they're fleshed out characters in their early 20s, each a master of a different fighting discipline. There's Adam Hunter, a powerhouse boxer with high strength but limited speed and jumping ability. Axel Stone, a martial artist who strikes a balance between speed and power but isn't great at jumping. And Blaze Fielding, a judo expert with agility and quickness to spare but less raw strength. Their differences aren't just cosmetic. Your choice impacts how you approach combat, making each character feel genuinely unique. Ultimately, the choice of character comes down to your personal playstyle. Whether you prefer Blaze's nimbleness, Adam's raw power, or Axel's versatility, none of the 3 is objectively better than the others. They're just different tools for taking down the crime syndicate that has consumed the city. With its gripping introduction and variety of gameplay styles, Streets of Rage wastes no time pulling you into its world. And as we dive into its mechanics and level design, you'll see how it pushed the beat-em-up genre forward. When it comes to controlling your characters, Streets of Rage makes full use of the Sega Mega Drive's early 3-button controller, offering a simple yet effective setup. Most players will instinctively press the A button first, unleashing the character's special move, a powerful screen-clearing attack that feels satisfying but comes with a strategic cost. The B button handles your main attacks, while the C button is for jumping. If you disregard the A button's screen nuke function, the core control scheme feels very familiar, echoing Final Fight with its reliance on just 2 action buttons and the directional pad. Each character has a straightforward attack combo triggered by tapping the attack button multiple times. Hit it 4 times in succession and you'll execute a satisfying combo. You can also perform jumping attacks by pressing attack mid-air, or rear attacks by pressing jump and attack simultaneously. Grapples and throws add another layer of depth. Simply walk into an enemy to initiate a grapple, then press attack to throw them, or tap attack repeatedly to perform a combo while grappling. You can even pull off flashy rear throws by positioning yourself appropriately and hit an attack. At first glance, these mechanics seem heavily influenced by Final Fight, but Streets of Rage doesn't just imitate, it innovates. The game expands on established beat-em-up mechanics by introducing advanced tactics that add more to the fun. For instance, you can perform reversals to counter an enemy's grapple, or even land safely after being thrown by pressing up on the D-pad at the right moment. These additions make combat feel more dynamic and give players more control over tight situations. But the game's standout feature was of course its two-player cooperative play, a key aspect absent in Final Fight Super Nintendo port. Not only does Streets of Rage bring back the cooperative gameplay of Final Fight's arcade version, but it goes a step further, introducing team attacks that elevate the multiplayer experience. You can hold an enemy in place while your teammate pummels them, or even vault over your partner for tactical positioning or stylish combo setups. These mechanics make cooperation feel integral rather than optional, encouraging players to coordinate and strategize rather than just fight alongside each other. While the controls and basic gameplay structure in Streets of Rage may seem heavily influenced by Final Fight, Sega's game goes far beyond being a mere clone. With clever innovations and mechanics, it not only rivals the 1989 arcade classic, but in my opinion, arguably surpasses it, with it being particularly leagues ahead of the Super Nintendo port. Moving on to the game's stages, players must battle their way through 8 distinct levels, referred to as rounds. This stage-based progression is another nod to beat-em-up tradition established by similar titles. Along the way, you'll face a relentless wave of recurring enemies, each with unique attack patterns and movement behaviours to keep the action fresh. To deal with these foes, you'll rely not only on your combat moves, but also the game's arsenal of pick-up weapons, a hallmark of the genre introduced in early games from the genre. Whether it's pipes, knives or bats, these weapons allow you to inflict serious damage. In addition, items scattered across the stages help restore health, trigger special attacks or grant extra lives, making exploration and timing crucial to survival. Visually, the stages and character sprites in Streets of Rage take a slightly different approach from Final Fight. The sprites here are smaller and less detailed than their counterparts in Capcom's game, but although less impressive to look at, this choice serves a surprising practical purpose. The smaller scale of characters allow for more freedom of movement across the screen, making the gameplay feel less cramped. In the first Streets of Rage game, Sega struck an excellent balance, creating sprites that are clean and functional, while still managing to convey personality and style. It's also worth noting that Streets of Rage was released early in the Sega Mega Drive's lifecycle, when developers were still mastering the hardware, and despite the limitations of the era, a great co-op game was still achieved. As for a stage-by-stage breakdown of what can be experienced in the game, the first round of Streets of Rage drops you into a neon-lit street bathed in the glow of late-night city lights. Despite being released in 1991, this opening stage oozes 80s nostalgia, capturing the essence of the era's martial arts films and urban grit, with the Streets of Fire influence being as clear as day to see. As you progress into round 2, the stage feels like a deliberate nod to the first level of Final Fight, where you fight your way past a series of dilapidated buildings. The gritty urban decay of both games is strikingly similar. As we press forward, round 3 takes things further, with the setting mirroring a palm tree lined street from Final Fight, complete with a city skyline in the background. Even the enemies evoke deja vu. A dominatrix styled enemy wielding a whip bears an uncanny resemblance to Poison, the iconic antagonist from Final Fight, who again looks like the dominatrixes that can be found in Double Dragon. These developers love these ladies of the night. Round 4 stays true to the trend with a waterfront stage set against a glowing city skyline at dusk. There's another scene that could easily be mistaken for a Final Fight backdrop, though Streets of Rage sets itself apart slightly by placing the characters on a bridge, adding some variety to the level design. In round 5 you board a boat, a setting that departs slightly from Final Fight stages but still share striking similarities. The boat's scrolling backgrounds, visible through large windows, are reminiscent of the train stage in Final Fight, where movement is emphasised through fast-scrolling scenery. The similarities in level design between these two games are so pronounced that it borderlines on imitation, though Streets of Rage always manages to add its own subtle twists to avoid feeling like a direct copy. Round 6 in Streets of Rage takes place in a construction-themed stage, complete with various obstacles to navigate, with round 7 beginning in an elevator, a classic hallmark of the genre and another page taken out of Final Fight's playbook. Finally, Round 8 delivers a dramatic climax set in a luxurious high-rise reminiscent of Trump Tower, complete with gold pillars and opulent decor, once again mirroring the design of other games in the genre. How ornate. But while the skyscraper setting would be familiar to seasoned gamers, the final boss fight in Streets of Rage is where the game truly sets itself apart somewhat. Unlike Final Fight, this confrontation offers multiple endings depending on whether you and your partner decide to join the crime boss. If the players make opposing choices, they are even forced to fight each other to resolve their differing allegiances. For a beat 'em up in 1991, this branching narrative was a fresh and innovative touch, adding replay value and a layer of moral choice that felt groundbreaking at the time. It's a small but impactful feature that helped Streets of Rage stand out from its contemporaries. Upon release, Streets of Rage was met with universal acclaim. Critics lauded its vibrant sprites, atmospheric backdrops, and brilliant soundtrack composed by user Koshiro. The game's tight gameplay, simultaneous two-player action, and overall polish made it a standout title. Megatech magazine praised it as excellent, and its lasting appeal was underscored where Megaplay ranked it 6th on its list of the best Mega Drive games of all time. With its combination of refined gameplay, innovative features, and unforgettable style, Streets of Rage didn't just emulate its predecessors, it quickly cemented itself as a genre-defining classic. By 1992, Streets of Rage wasn't just a 16-bit exclusive, it began branching out to other platforms. That year, a game made its way to the Game Gear, Sega's 8-bit handheld system. Unsurprisingly, this version had to be significantly scaled back to accommodate the simpler hardware. The most notable change was the reduction of the game's stages, of only 5 of the original 8 rounds making the cut. Adam Hunter also didn't make the trip, leaving players with just Axel and Blaze as their playable options. The graphics were simplified as expected, but they were still leaps and bounds ahead of anything that ever appeared on the Game Boy at the time. Unfortunately, due to the Game Gear's limitations, the beloved 2-player cooperative mode was scrapped entirely. Still, all things considered, this was a respectable port. In 1992, having Streets of Rage on the go was a treat, and Sega did an admirable job of bringing the game to a handheld format. It wasn't perfect, but it offered a solid experience for players who wanted a slice of urban brawling action away from the home. In 1993, Sega revisited Streets of Rage, this time porting it to the Sega Master System, their 8-bit home console. While this move might seem odd, it made sense in the context of the early 90s. The Master System still had a large and dedicated fanbase, particularly in Europe, Australia and Brazil, where it remained popular even after the Mega Drive's release. Bringing a flagship title like Streets of Rage to the system was a strategic way to reach those audiences. What's surprising about the Master System port is that it's not just a scaled-down version of the Mega Drive original, it's a remarkable effort that stays true to the source material. Unlike the Game Gear version, this port includes all 8 stages and retains all 3 playable characters, Axel, Blaze and Adam. For an 8-bit system, the graphics are incredibly impressive, standing far above anything you'll find on the NES. The Master System port captures the essence of the original in a way that feels almost miraculous, given the hardware's limitations. That said, the absence of cooperative play, even in this polished version, is a missed opportunity. However, Sega's efforts to expand the Streets of Rage franchise beyond the 16-bit market was undeniably successful. These 8-bit versions showcase the game's adaptability and quality, far outperforming the 8-bit microcomputer ports of Final Fight. The comparison is a stark reminder of the gulfing quality between Sega's first-party efforts and the often lackluster ports of third-party publishers, like US Gold. Yuck. With these ports, Sega demonstrated their commitment to delivering top-notch gaming experiences regardless of the platform. Ultimately, while Final Fight was the trailblazer that helped define the beat-em-up genre, Streets of Rage refined and perfected the formula. It added speed, depth, and a sense of style that made it the definitive home console beat-em-up of its time. Both games are icons in their own right, and their contributions to gaming history remain monumental. But while many believe Final Fight peaked at its first entry, when it comes to Streets of Rage, the best was yet to come. As for this franchise's future, what might surprise you is that initially, Sega of Japan had no plans to develop Streets of Rage 2, because the first game, while successful, was seen as a Western-driven project rather than a key part of Sega's domestic strategy. Beat-em-ups were not as dominant in the Japanese market as they were in North America and Europe. While Streets of Rage had gained a passionate following, Sega's Japanese headquarters focused on projects that aligned more closely with local tastes, such as RPGs and arcade-style games. However, the Western reception of Streets of Rage exceeded expectations, and the rise of a 16-bit console wars, especially the competition with the Super Nintendo, pushed Sega to revisit the franchise. Tom Kalinske, then CEO of Sega America, played a crucial role in the push to develop Streets of Rage 2. Kalinske was a strong advocate for tailoring Sega's game lineup to Western markets, where the Genesis Mega Drive was thriving and action games were immensely popular. Recognising the potential of Streets of Rage as a franchise that could compete directly with Nintendo's growing library of standouts, Kalinske lobbied Sega of Japan to prioritise a sequel. His focus on aggressive marketing and delivering games that resonated with Western audiences helped convince Sega of Japan to invest in Streets of Rage 2. Kalinske's involvement ensured that the game received a higher production value and additional development resources, which resulted in a sequel that not only met the expectations of fans, but became one of the most iconic beat-em-ups of a 16-bit era, hell, of all time. In the past, Kalinske commented, "Our strategy was to market to an older audience than Nintendo did, and Streets of Rage certainly appealed to that teen and college market. It was an action-filled game, constant action, easy to get into and somewhat difficult to complete. The great music was also really appealing to our audience, which made it a strategically important element for us. After the first game's success, we wanted a second game, but because it had not been as successful in Japan, Sega of Japan didn't want to move forward with it. It took a lot of phone calls across the Pacific, cajoling and begging to finally get Sega of Japan to agree to develop Streets of Rage 2. In my opinion, it was even better than the first game. Once again, the fast action and incredible music made it a huge and important part of our strategy to target an older audience and differentiate ourselves from Nintendo. The race to produce Streets of Rage 2 was on." When it came to the undertaking of such a task, Sega were keen to create this game as quickly as possible. This was seen as key at the time in order to continue to rapidly expand the Genesis' system library and remain competitive against Nintendo. Keeping all of this in mind, Sega aimed to have such a title released before Christmas of 1992 in North America, just over a year after the original game debuted on the platform. Achieving this would be far from easy, therefore Sega would pull in a lot of outside help and would opt to recruit several development teams to work with them. Duties would be performed on an ad hoc basis to get this huge game out in time for the festive period. As plans for this game were rolled out, some of the game's programming, planning and graphic design were outsourced to a company known as Shout Design Works. This studio was newly established in 1992 by Akishi Amai, a dot artist who had previously worked at Atlus. In fact, some of the game's main programming and system design can both be credited to Shout. Building on the collaborative effort that was undertaken to make this game possible, M&M Software was also tasked to work on the title. They took on planning aspects in the development of the game and were given the responsibility of handling a sound driver. M&M stands for this, which translates to everyone making money together harmoniously, an ethic that company founder Makoto Ichikawa stood by. On the subject of this inspirational individual, he is notable for challenging the status quo regarding the dreadful work-life balance faced by many workers living in Japan. Upset with Japanese working culture, he would found his own company promoting different values, stating, "I had seen people take credit for other people's hard work. Not only that, I had witnessed several deaths from overwork. Managers took advantage of shy and modest programmers. They would pick some programmers as lead, and these programmers would work so hard, thinking we were chosen, we must work hard. They would eventually burn out. Sometimes the worst awaited them. I thought this was very wrong, but these things were allowed to happen without anyone even questioning the situation. I decided to start my own company where I wouldn't allow such things to happen." Sadly, as we know, the negative aspect of Japanese working culture still persists to this day, contributing to the country having one of the highest suicide rates in the world. However, it is nice to know that some individuals at least, including those who worked on Streets of Rage 2, have been recognising and trying to tackle these issues for quite some time. Yet another reason to love the legendary game. Elsewhere on the project, demo programming and some of the enemy sprite work were carried out by a group known as HIC. But the most legendary entity who would be involved with the creation of this game were of course Ancient. You know, the company founded by iconic composer Yuzo Koshiro along with his mother and sister, that would include many of the masterminds behind the first game. Ancient took on some of the largest aspects of Streets of Rage 2's development. This included further game planning, the game's main design, including the background objects and many of the game's characters. On their side of things, Ancient also created the game's legendary composition and sound effects under the leadership of Yuzo Koshiro, with 3 contributions from Motohiro Kawashima, another now legendary video game composer in his own right.
Keeping track of everything we have covered so far, I hope the picture is beginning to come clear to you that the development of Streets of Rage 2 was a huge undertaking and was an impressive collaborative effort between 4 different development studios and of course Sega, who were overseeing the entire project. The game was made with the intention to be bigger and better than any Mega Drive game that had been made before it. All of this was only made possible due to the hard work of the programmers involved, who would work tirelessly improving the Mega Drive cartridge specification. This allowed the Streets of Rage 2 team to add more features and additional memory cache by creating 16 megabyte carts. This would allow for the literally biggest Mega Drive game ever produced. Fortunately for everyone involved, all these efforts would hugely pay off, since the game became both a commercial and critical success. In fact, history now shows us that many perceive the game to be not just the best entry in the series, but the best game in the beat 'em up genre, and one of the greatest video games of all time period. The game is simply that damn good. There is just so much to love about this one, which is made all the more clear the more we begin to look at the extent of the resources that will be poured into crafting this one. We will cover more on this game's development in a moment, but first let's turn our attention to this game's magnificent story and characters. Mirroring the real well between releases in the game's story, 1 year has passed since the events of the first game and the defeat of Mr. X and his dastardly criminal organisation. However, all is not as peaceful as it seems. One day, Blaze receives a phone call from the affable Skate, the younger brother of Adam, one of the playable characters from the previous game. Skate provides us with the revelation that Mr. X is back and has not only maniacally kidnapped Adam, but has retaken the streets too. This simple to digest story instantly establishes the game's narrative, giving a solid reason to put the player back on the streets in an opportunity to fight through waves of enemies all over again, but this time with stakes higher than ever before. For those going into this one straight off the back of the previous experience, for the most part Streets of Rage 2 goal-wise remains largely unchanged from its predecessor. However, there were some notable changes that set this game apart from the classic that came before it. For starters, the biggest change visually with Streets of Rage 2 is the fact that it features much bigger sprites, bolder backgrounds, and even some diagonal scrolling being included in the opening stage to really separate it stylistically from what came before it. As for impact on the beat 'em up genre overall, many have made a case that the original Streets of Rage game for the Mega Drive featured more impressive gameplay than what could even be found in the original Final Fight arcade game. However, while this was the case, it was very hard to dispute that Final Fight didn't still hold the graphical edge out of the 2 early games, with the Capcom title featuring bigger and more impressive sprites. As cut and dry as this seemingly was, Streets of Rage 2 rectified its previous inferiorities by offering up an experience that looked arguably even prettier than Capcom's classic game. Streets of Rage 2 was every bit as beautiful as coin-operated video games from the same genre, which was unprecedented at the time. Speaking of this game's beauty, none of this would have been possible if it were not for a woman known as Ayano Koshiro, the sister of Yuzo Koshiro, who came up with the character's special moves and attacks. In the past, she has mentioned that while the first Streets of Rage game was heavily inspired by Final Fight, Streets of Rage 2 was inspired by a newer and even more successful Capcom game. I am of course referring to one of the most important arcade games ever made, Street Fighter 2. Regarding this, Ayano has stated in the past that there was also a certain flow to the fighting that we wanted. I am sure you played Street Fighter 2, my brother and I did too. We liked it so much we bought a cabinet and had it installed in the office at Ancient. My brother and I liked the way they thought in Street Fighter 2, and between the two of us a shared vision of the fighting of Streets of Rage 2 arose. 2 jabs followed by a straight punch. There's some heavy hits and the enemy goes flying. That kind of flow had to be in there. Taking influence from Chun-Li and company, the team would ensure that the fighting in Streets of Rage 2 was more refined than in any beat 'em up that had preceded it. In relation to this beloved game's combat, Ayano has also explained previously why Streets of Rage 2 features a different playable lineup of fighters than what can be found in the previous game. Those who have played this game will be more than aware that Axel and Blaze remain, but as briefly touched on earlier, Adam was removed. In the game's plot, his kidnapping serves as an excuse for him no longer being a playable character. However, in reality, a more pertinent reason exists for his exclusion. According to Ayano, the team at Ancient felt that Adam didn't really bring anything different to the table that Axel didn't bring to the game already. So to introduce more gameplay diversity, the decision was made to cut Adam. Ayano saw characters in Streets of Rage 2 being even more important than with the previous game, as now the character sprites were much more impressive and much bigger. Since they included much more detail than before, Ayano wanted each of them to have more varied attacks and movements, so taking out Adam and introducing 2 further characters was just a quick and practical way of achieving this feat. As for the 2 new individuals that were brought to the table, we first have Skate, a character who is positioned as Adam's younger brother, giving him story importance beyond just his gameplay. Skate was designed to be a super manoeuvrable character with a tricky style that requires some skill, made with experienced beat-em-up players in mind. The other new character is of course the pro wrestler known as Max, who I guess is Streets of Rage's answer to Hagar. Max obviously has a power style and was partly created due to Ayano's brother Yuzo adoring throw-based characters. With access to this famous foursome, Ayano believes the roster is well balanced and gives players a choice between using 2 very standard characters and 2 quirky new ones. Once again, considering how much so many people love this game, who could disagree with her? Speaking of the characters in Streets of Rage 2 and the game's combat inspired by Street Fighter 2, the characters each have their own unique blitz attacks, a function which allows players to deal colossal amounts of damage with a single hit. Building on mechanical additions, they can also execute what are known as breakout moves. These are used to break holds and allow players to damage enemies from both in front of and behind opponents. Players must use blitz and breakout moves strategically though, as using them decreases the character's life bar, a mechanic that seems to have been plucked right from Final Fight. Also mirroring Street Fighter 2, each character has their own unique moves. For example, Axel can execute a grand uppercut. These unique moves do substantial damage and differ from blitz attacks as they do not deplete the player's own life bar. In terms of the game's stage design, right from the opening level, the influence from the previous game is unmistakable. Yet everything now looks bolder, brighter and more beautiful than ever before. The designers have pushed the boundaries, creating a visual feast that captures the player's imagination instantly. One standout feature is the dynamic diagonal scrolling that we mentioned earlier. This signals to the player that while this game might feel familiar, it's an entirely new and even more impressive adventure. As you progress, you soon find yourself brawling through a lively bar area, an exciting nod to the iconic final fight absent in the original Streets of Rage. This thrilling addition sets the stage for what's to come, and by the second stage you're crossing a bridge against a stunning nighttime city backdrop, evoking memories of both Streets of Rage and Final Fight. But just as nostalgia kicks in, brand new mechanics take the stage. Motorcycle riders and fresh enemy types burst onto the scene, introducing elements never before seen in the genre. In the unfolding adventure that this sequel delivers, Stage 1 and 2 firmly establish a fresh aesthetic, showcasing to players that they're embarking on a revitalised journey. But it's Stage 3 where the adventure truly diversifies, plunging you into a dazzling theme park offering up a backdrop unlike anything seen in the predecessor. Here the excitement reaches new heights as your characters find themselves battling on a pirate ship, adding an unexpected twist to the brawling action. Then comes Stage 4, where the developers venture into even more experimental territory, with an alien theme level. Ayano Koshiro provides fascinating insight into this stage, revealing the biggest influence on that stage progression was probably the Contra series. Each stage in Contra feels like a distinct world, given a sense of backstory without words. I think you get a sense of it just from the stage progression. Koshiro also shares a personal touch, noting Streets of Rage 2 is filled with things that my friends and I loved. Do you remember their enemy Jack with a knife? His palette swap is called Bino. These names came from a soybean candy we all adored. Stage 5 seamlessly integrates the theme park from Stage 3 as a scenic backdrop, setting the scene for an intense descent down a lift, a classic beat-em-up trope. As I always point out, it seems illegal to exclude this setting from a game in the genre. At the bottom, the stage culminates with an underground boss encounter. Stage 6 ramps up the excitement aboard a moving boat, a nostalgic nod to the first Streets of Rage game, which itself drew inspiration from Final Fight's moving train stage. This dynamic level, with ground moving beneath players and the scenery scrolling in the background, has become a hallmark of the genre, adding more layers of immersion and thrill to the gameplay. The journey intensifies in the next stage, starting on a beautiful beach, where players begin their fight down a road that progressively transforms into a war-torn battlefield. The cracked concrete, barbed wire fences, and sandbag barricades tell a vivid story of escalating conflict. Hordes of bikers and enemies confront the player, enhancing the sense of approaching an epic showdown. This level design masterfully conveys the narrative, much like Ayano Koshiro described with the Contra series. You can feel the tension rising as you cross the sea, land on the beach and face increasing obstacles on your path to the boss's keep. In Stage 7, the game embraces the classic factory style level, complete with conveyor belts, robots and more lifts, staples of a genre that fans eagerly anticipate. The player's upward progression culminates in Stage 8, reaching the top of a towering structure where the final boss encounter awaits. The last level is a relentless gauntlet, a fitting final frontier that throws everything at the player, leading to the ultimate showdown with Mr. X. This climactic battle encapsulates the thrill and challenge that defines Streets of Rage 2, promising an unforgettable conclusion to this epic journey. What a game this one is. Something else worth noting is that throughout one's adventure, you might notice that enemy sprites in Streets of Rage 2 are crafted with the same meticulous detail as the playable fighters, a testament to the intense scrutiny during production. Ayano Koshiro of Ancient revealed the challenges she faced in this process, expressing frustration over the quality of outsourced enemy pixel art. She remarked, "This was down to the quality of the enemy pixel art we got back from the people we outsourced that work to. I had to have them redraw it so many times. Somehow what I was saying just wasn't getting through to them. In the end I had to do it myself. I retouched a lot of the backgrounds myself too, but I will say that the backgrounds done by Nakai Satoshi were amazing. Stuff like the area where you're inside the ship, the atmosphere of the pipes, and the rust. I was amazed at what he pulled off with such a limited colour palette." The diverse and intricately designed enemies combined with a stunning stage backdrops are just a few elements that make Streets of Rage 2 extraordinary. The dedicated team at Ancient played a crucial role in these achievements. Each level features a variety of enemies and culminates in unique boss encounters with distinct attack patterns, enhancing the game's challenge and strategic depth. Every pulse-pounding moment and stunning piece of artwork in Streets of Rage 2 is elevated by what many consider to be one of the greatest in-game soundtracks of all time. The majority of the game's composition, as mentioned earlier, was crafted by Yuzo Koshiro, hailed by Nintendo Power as arguably the greatest game music composer of the 16-bit era. The soundtrack of Streets of Rage 2 was ahead of its time, blending swaggering house synths, gritty electro-funk, and early trance elements to create an unforgettable auditory experience. Added to this musical masterpiece, we have the three exceptional tracks composed by Motohiro Kawashima, a renowned Japanese video game composer and techno producer who later contributed to Streets of Rage 3 as well. The collaboration between Koshiro and Kawashima resulted in a soundtrack that not only complements the game's intense action, but also stands on its own as a groundbreaking achievement in video game music history. Few soundtracks in video games' long existence are as celebrated as that of Streets of Rage. When Streets of Rage 2 hit the shelves in December of 1992, it was met with widespread critical acclaim, instantly cementing its legacy in gaming history. GamePro awarded it a perfect score of 5 out of 5, stating that Streets of Rage 2 not only stood toe-to-toe with heavyweights like Final Fight and Super Double Dragon, but also established itself as a side-scrolling equivalent of Street Fighter 2 in the beat-em-up genre. Fans echoed this sentiment, giving the game an astounding 97% rating and lauding it as the best fighting and side-scrolling fighter game they had ever played. Praise flowed for its gameplay, graphics, sound effects and music, culminating in the consensus that it was the best beat-em-up sequel of 1992. Sega Force reviewers bestowed a 95% score, declaring it the best beat-em-up on any console and the greatest boon to Mega Drive owners since the advent of a certain Blue Hedgehog. Mean Machine Sega chimed in with a 90% score, with one reviewer calling it a truly arcade quality beat-em-up that outshone any Neo Geo contender. They even suggested that non-fans of the genre should buy it, predicting that the game would convert them. Beyond the game's technical excellence, its soundtrack received such acclaim that Yuzo Koshiro, the composer, was invited to DJ the tracks in nightclubs, further solidifying Streets of Rage 2's impact on both gaming and music culture, and a move which was pretty much unprecedented in gaming before this release. Taking into account everything we have explored and examined in this video, it becomes abundantly clear why so many consider Streets of Rage 2 to be the pinnacle of Sega's gaming legacy. Widely regarded as the Mega Drive's finest hour, Streets of Rage 2 offered an unparalleled experience. While games like Sonic 3 provided great fun and variety, they still faced stiff competition from platforming giants like Super Mario World and Super Mario Bros. 3. Streets of Rage 2, however, stands in a league of its own. It's hard to argue that any beat-em-up on the Super Nintendo even approaches the level of greatness achieved by Streets of Rage 2. Upon its release, the game had no equal in the home gaming market, and continues to hold its ground against arcade beat-em-ups even today. The game's quality and impact are undeniable. Outside of the Sonic series, no 16-bit era Sega franchise or title has reached the same cultural significance as Streets of Rage. What sets Streets of Rage 2 apart from even Sonic is that it was never surpassed by any of its contemporaries. For this reason, I, along with countless other Sega fans, firmly believe that Streets of Rage 2 is the greatest Sega game ever made, a timeless classic that remains unmatched to this day. Known as Bare Knuckaroo 3 in Japan, Streets of Rage 3, like what came before it, was developed under an ambitiously short timeline for such a significant title. Released in Japan in March 1994, just 15 months after its predecessor, it seems that despite a quick turnaround, a tremendous amount of heart and passion was poured into this creation. So much so that not all ideas made it into the final product, as evidenced by an early pre-release screenshot showing a section where players could ride these motorcycles, for example. The game, published by Sega, was once again developed in yet another collaborative effort with Ancient, with Yuzo Koshiro again at the helm, whose contributions we shall speak about more on later in the video. As mentioned earlier, the quality leap between the first two Streets of Rage games was substantial, with the second game being significantly more refined. When it came to Streets of Rage 3, Sega and Ancient set out to achieve a similar feat. To realise this, Streets of Rage 3 was programmed to include a more complex plot, character dialogue, even more multiple endings, longer stages, increased difficulty options, more in-depth scenarios, and even faster gameplay. Let's begin to explore these elements and their impact on the game's overall quality. The plot of Streets of Rage 3 once again centres on the series' antagonist, Mr. X, the leader of a dangerous crime syndicate. This time, Mr. X has established a dubious research company known as Robo-Psi Corporation. As part of his sinister scheme, he recruits a doctor, the world's foremost roboticist. Together, they plan to replace every important official in the city with realistic-looking robots, using strategically placed bombs around the city as a distraction for the police. This brings us to the game's character lineup: Axel Stone, Blaze Fielding, and Eddie Skate Hunter, who return to action, joined by a new playable character, Dr. Zan. Dr. Zan, having uncovered the true purpose of Mr. X's research corporation, contacts the trio. United, they set out once more to save the city from Mr. X's nefarious plans. In terms of the title's gameplay, like the previous Streets of Rage games, unsurprisingly this entry is yet another arcade-style side-scrolling beat-em-up, in which up to 2 players must fight their way through the streets defeating wave upon wave of enemies. The 3 returning characters retain their familiar playstyles from the previous installment. However, the introduction of Dr. Zan adds a fresh dynamic to the gameplay. Dr. Zan, a robot, uniquely converts every weapon pickup into a ball of energy, which he can then use against his enemies. Additionally, Streets of Rage 3 sets itself apart from its predecessors by being the first in the series to include unlockable playable characters, and an extra layer of depth and replayability as well as a topping of controversy, but more on this spiciness soon. But for now, let's delve into the game's level design and narrative progression. The adventure begins with a Star Wars-esque opening text scroll, followed by a selection of playable fighters. Character dialogue boxes then appear, showing the characters debating whether the Dr. Zan is trustworthy as they work to dispose of the city's first bomb. This conversation seamlessly transitions players into the opening stage set in a warehouse. Immediately, players will notice that the game's graphics closely resemble those of Streets of Rage 2. Many of the same enemy sprites are used, and the game seems to run on the same engine. While this might initially seem like a lack of innovation, it also adheres to the principle of not fixing what isn't broken. The familiar visual style preserves the series' established aesthetic and ensures a seamless experience for returning players. While not everything about Streets of Rage 3 screams greatness, its visuals are still top notch. As you progress through the stage, you'll face off against sleek gun-wielding enemies in sharp suits, and as you move further, the action spills outside onto a dock, where the challenge intensifies. The stage keeps you on your toes with a mix of familiar foes from the first game, including menacing motorbike riders. Enemies also make a dramatic entrance via a speedboat, adding to the excitement with a cool watery backdrop effect. As you fight your way through, the passage of time becomes evident, shifting from daylight to a beautiful sunset, setting the stage for the climactic boss battle. This encounter is particularly thrilling as you face the now legendary Shiva. Not only is he a formidable opponent, but you can unlock him as a playable character by holding down the B button after defeating him, adding an extra layer of significance to the showdown. After triumphing over Shiva in the South Pier warehouse stage, the player advances to the electrifying downtown area. The scene opens with a backdrop that pays homage to the iconic settings of the first two Streets of Rage games, complete with vibrant neon lights that capture the essence of the second game. Early in this stage you face a bizarre mid-boss fight against an evil clown and a kangaroo. Defeating these quirky adversaries not only clears your path, but also liberates the kangaroo, who becomes another beloved unlockable character you can use to grow your delightful roster. As action progresses, the next segment takes you into a pulsating nightclub, brimming with lasers, dynamic lighting effects, and an animated crowd that enhances the immersive atmosphere. The lights flicker on and off, creating a strobe effect that intensifies the gameplay and showcases the innovative level design that helps set this experience apart. In the nightclub stage, you engage in a boss fight against the athletic twin sisters, Lisa and Mona. The bar area where this showdown occurs is intricately designed with stunning aquarium walls behind the bars and glass bottles crashing down as the battle rages on. After emerging victorious and discovering a note revealing the Syndicate's whereabouts, the action shifts to the District K construction site for Stage 3. Combat in this stage kicks off with players dodging barrels falling from above, a clear homage to the classic Donkey Kong game. But it's not just the barrels you need to watch out for, there are perilous pits to avoid as well. This stage introduces new challenges beyond just fighting enemies, because as the level progresses, the intensity ramps up. Players must channel their inner Chuck Norris, punching through concrete barriers to evade an unstoppable auto-scrolling bulldozer hurtling towards them. This level design adds a fresh dynamic to the Streets of Rage formula, adding something slightly different from the well-trodden path of most of the series. The next stage plunges players back into familiar territory packed with standard brawler action. Red beams illuminate the path as you navigate a moving lift filled with enemies, delivering classic beat-em-up thrills amidst the dynamic scenery. At the top of a construction site awaits a gripping boss encounter with your character's robotic doppelganger, confirming the truth behind Dr. Zan's warnings. Moving forward, the cast discovers a hidden door leading to an underground stage. Here players must deftly avoid fast-moving railway carts while battling waves of Syndicate foes. The environment transitions into a more mine-like setting, adding to the sense of danger and urgency. The climax of this stage is a fierce boss fight against Yamato, a red armoured samurai with the ability to create clones of himself, making for a challenging showdown. While we'll delve deeper into the music later, it's worth noting that this stage features a captivating remix of the opening theme from Revenge of Shinobi, adding a nostalgic twist. After vanquishing Yamato, it becomes clear he was guarding the entrance to the Syndicate's secret hideout. Unexpectedly, the hideout exudes a distinctly Eastern atmosphere, resembling a Yakuza lair more than a New York City crime syndicate base. Although this stylistic choice is visually appealing, it feels somewhat out of place within the game's overall Western theme. Soon, players find themselves battling their way through the opulent corridors of Mr. X's skyscraper. The action kicks off in an elegant hallway, followed by an intense elevator brawl, once again embodying classic beat-em-up excitement. At the top of the tower, Mr. X awaits in his extravagant, gold-plated throne room, reminiscent of Trump Tower. As he watches you fend off waves of enemies, it becomes evident that this encounter is far from a final showdown. The Mr. X you face is in fact another robotic doppelganger. The next stage plunges you deeper into the tower, where you fight through more lavish hallways, this time filled with Terminator-like robots. The challenge escalates as you descend in a lift confronting gangsters, dominatrixes and other familiar foes. This sequence of relentless battles, although very challenging, keeps the adrenaline pumping and sets the stage for the ultimate confrontation. In this stage, you rescue the head of the city's police force, adding a heroic twist to your mission. The gameplay then shifts outside the building, where you engage in combat against classic-style jetpack-wielding adversaries reminiscent of the previous game. The relentless onslaught intensifies until a dramatic moment when Adam, a beloved character from the first Streets of Rage game, makes a surprise entrance. He arrives in a helicopter, gunning down enemies and reuniting with his old friends in a heart-pounding sequence. Moving closer to the game's conclusion, the next level takes you behind enemy lines into a dense woodland-like area, heightening this title's tension as you edge closer to the game's climax. The journey culminates at the RoboPsi Corporation's factory, a labyrinth of moving conveyor belts and guard lasers. Here you face a relentless barrage of both robotic and human opponents, navigating the treacherous terrain trudging ever closer to the end. After seeing this much of the game, it becomes clear that Streets of Rage 3 has drawn significant inspiration from sci-fi classics like Terminator and RoboCop, marking a shift from the martial arts-centric focus of its predecessors. This influence is evident in the boss fight against Tech, a challenging adversary. However, the stage doesn't end there. Next you encounter the true Mr. X, now reduced to just a brain in a tube, eerily reminiscent of Mother Brain from the Metroid series or Elon Musk from our future. The game's climax features a thrilling final battle against a powerful robot. You must defeat this mechanical menace within 3 minutes to prevent Mr. X from detonating bombs that will obliterate the entire city, and a now-biting sense of urgency when trying to cross the finish line. Upon completing the game, players are treated to different endings based on the difficulty setting, serving up a compelling layer of replayability. This feature encourages gamers to tackle the game again on higher difficulty levels for a new experience. Additionally, the endings are influenced by specific events during the playthrough. For instance, if the player fails to save the police chief in one of the later stages, an alternative final stage unfolds in a location resembling the White House. Here you face off against Shiva once more. Defeating him triggers the bad ending, where he ominously reveals that Mr. X is still watching and plans to finish you off, as shown on the monitor. This dynamic approach to storytelling ensures that different playthroughs have the possibility of offering different outcomes. Examining all the stages in Streets of Rage 3, it's evident that while many elements are recycled from Streets of Rage 2, the game still manages, to some degree at least, to stand on its own. Significant tweaks and additions enhance the overall experience. For instance, previously, only Skate could run, but now all characters have this ability, adding a new layer of agility to combat. Enemy AI has been notably improved. For example, they can now pick up weapons, block attacks, coordinate cooperative attacks, and even steal exposed food items to regain health, making encounters more challenging and dynamic. Additionally, blitz attacks, a staple of the previous game, can be upgraded through successive play. A rechargeable meter allows players to perform special attacks without losing health when full, adding strategic depth. These enhancements ensure that Streets of Rage 3 offers something new for long-term players of these titles. In terms of more pros, the overall level design coupled with engaging dialogue makes the story in Streets of Rage 3 more compelling than ever, providing players with a strong incentive to keep fighting to uncover the game's narrative. This deepens the connection to the plot and enhances the motivation to progress. Another critical aspect worth discussing in any Streets of Rage 3 retrospective is of course the game's controversial music. Composed by the same talented team behind the previous game, the soundtrack plays a vital role in shaping the game's atmosphere. While many players favoured the music from Streets of Rage 2, the composers have noted that the soundtrack for this installment aligns closely with the game's overall theme, contributing to its distinctive feel. One of the series' composers, Motohiro Karashima, states, "With Bare Knuckaroo 3, we got rid of even more of the human element. We were really trying to crank up the meter with what we were making for that game. I think that's what Koshiro-san had in mind. He wanted us to give it a more decadent feel." Yuzo Koshiro himself adds, "It's the kind of soundtrack that leaves you wondering where the melody is. It took a bad beating from listeners at the time. I remember hearing people say that it wasn't even music. It was really experimental, and I made it believing that kind of era was on the horizon." What I find particularly interesting about this quote is how much has changed since I last revisited this story in 2020. Back then it seemed somewhat irrelevant, however living in 2024, where AI generated content has become common, the concept resonates more deeply. We are now in an era where music created entirely by machines is our reality. While the soundtrack of Streets of Rage 3 was widely disliked at the time, I guess the people of the 90s just weren't ready for music like this yet, but their kids were gonna love it. The music in Streets of Rage 3 wasn't the only controversial aspect of the game. With the title's release, there were other big changes, the largest of these being that the Western version of this game had been censored and altered so drastically that you could almost argue that they ended up being two completely different games. A case could be made that this happened in part due to the fact that this was a time when Sega of America was past its prime, and heavy-handed localization policies were rampant. It felt as though Sega were following the same restrictive practices often attributed to Nintendo, which could partially explain why Sony began to dominate the video game industry just a year later. This was certainly a case of Genesis does what Nintendo does. The localization of Bare Knuckaroo 3 into Streets of Rage 3 did more than just censor the game. It often involved completely removing features. The story was significantly altered, resulting in numerous plot holes and missing key scenes. In a bizarre move, Sega of America even increased the difficulty for the international release, likely to prevent consumers from completing it during a rental from Blockbuster Video, thereby encouraging them to purchase the game outright later. Reasons were quickly mounting up for people to feel outraged about this game. Colour changes to sprites led to inconsistencies with the box art, adding to the confusion, and additionally, in a move reminiscent of Nintendo's censorship practices, Sega of America mandated more clothing from scantily clad female characters. Free Stellar Blade? Where is my free Streets of Rage 3 movement? These extensive changes significantly impacted the game's reception and coherence, dragging it further and further away from the source material. Regarding the localization, Sega of America also removed the mini-boss and secret playable character named Ash, seemingly because they perceived the character to be too homosexual.
Oh, kinky!
I guess the edgy Sega of America weren't quite as edgy as they would try to have you believe. Now, Ash was, in my opinion at least, a hilariously absurd character. Looking like Mr. Slave from South Park, this burly bear would mince around in combat, wearing high-heeled boots, which was made all the more amusing by the fact that this raging homosexual would fight by bitch-slapping his opponents. When grounded by his foes, Ash expresses his emotions more than other fighters too, by literally bursting into tears. The West would have this daddy ripped from their games, with Sega America still hating this character enough to censor him completely out of the Western releases of the Japanese release of Bare Knuckaroo 3 on the Sega Genesis Mini 2. They really do want nothing to do with him. The reason for Ash's removal has never been clarified by Sega, but speculations range from him being taken out of the game due to 90s Americans potentially not wanting scantily clad homosexuals in the games their children were playing, to others believing he was removed due to Ash being a negative stereotype. While both are believable, particularly when we take into account he got censored from the game recently too, let me ask you, is this character really that unrealistic? I've seen plenty of men both dressed and mincing around like this in videos of pride parades in the past. So with that said, let's start the free Streets of Rage 3 movement to stop this outrage and stop gaming censorship. Back in the day, the aggressive alterations to the title led to harsher reviews for the American version of the game. Some reviewers even recommended that gamers import the Japanese version to experience the game as intended, highlighting the extent to which these changes impacted the overall reception. Other review sources were urging gamers not to bother with the American version of the game, and to instead just import the Japanese game so that players could get the real experience. Many reviewers also thought the game was too similar to Streets of Rage 2, with GamePro commenting that the game is little different from previous entries in the series. Not all reviews of the title were negative though, with EGM praising the game for its new moves and large levels, though they did criticise the soundtrack being well below Yuzo Koshiro's usual standards. As a result, they scored the title an average 7.25 out of 10 across the board, with many publications responding similarly. Fast forward to 2024, many years after these controversies took place, as a whole trilogy is viewed favourably. However, in internet land, the third instalment doesn't seem to get the same level of praise as Streets of Rage 2, which is completely fair in all honesty. In my view, the leap in quality from the first game to the second was truly impressive, so much so that replicating it in the third title was simply not possible. However, the censorship and gap in quality between Bare Knuckaroo 3 and Streets of Rage 3 is simply not forgivable. Despite us getting a worse version of the game in the West, which would outrage many of us, a fitting analogy for Streets of Rage's original trilogy would be comparing it to the original Star Wars trilogy. If Streets of Rage 2 is the equivalent to The Empire Strikes Back, then the third installment is akin to Return of the Jedi. Streets of Rage 3 retained many of the qualities that made the second game great, but Yuzo Koshiro's bold and controversial music choices arguably is a major factor that prevented it from reaching the same level of acclaim. The soundtrack is basically the game's Ewoks. Yub-nub indeed. Atmosphere is crucial and music can elevate a game to the next level. Koshiro's arrangements in Streets of Rage 2 were like the perfect seasoning on a medium rare steak, enhancing every aspect of the experience. Although Streets of Rage 3 couldn't quite achieve the same effect, Koshiro still regards the soundtrack as some of his best work, even if it wasn't universally accepted or understood. It reminds me a bit of George Lucas's love for Jar Jar Binks and the Phantom Menace when he said, "I guess I went a little bit too far in places." Despite the localization controversies and backlash, I believe Streets of Rage 3 still managed to serve as a fitting conclusion to the trilogy. This enduring legacy helped fuel the demand for Sega to release Streets of Rage 4. Speaking of which, even if the third game wasn't close to good enough to instantly make Sega commission a follow-up, it was still decent enough to not prevent fans from clamouring for more for nearly 3 decades. Censorship and cutting content from games is rarely well received, and at the time consumers expected better from Sega. Fortunately, we can now easily emulate both versions of the game, which is a small consolation, even if Sega still don't want us to experience the safe embrace of Ash. Between the mid-90s and mid-2000s, 2D gaming had horrifically, practically died out. As a result, by the time the PS2, GameCube and Xbox era was in full swing, 2D gaming experiences had pretty much become restricted to handhelds, and the release of a Nintendo DS even threatened that stronghold. This 10-year period in history was all about the refinement of polygon gaming, and as time went on it seemed like 2D gaming experiences might end up dying out altogether. Building on this sad turn of events, the rare game that did show up with sprite-based graphics would usually get lower review scores, with the old visual style often being a reason for the unfair criticism. Fortunately, as bland as this era was for 2D gaming, in my opinion, this dull period in mainstream gaming led to the retro gaming boom, and later the many indie hits we can play today that are a million times more enjoyable and engaging than a lot of AAA experiences. The thirst for more of the old style only got stronger, the less games of the old style began to be produced. Even back then, many gamers grew sick and tired of playing the same AAA tripe, and by the time the Xbox and PS2 were popular, immense swaths of gamers had already turned back to their 8 and 16-bit consoles. These consoles delivered the high quality gaming experiences that the industry simply wasn't providing at the time. What made this revolution all the cooler is that enthusiasm for older games did not simply end with collecting and playing the games of the past. The progression in technology began to allow fans of these old games to create ROM hacks and fan games based on the 2D properties they knew and loved. Over time, with the shift in market forces chasing technological advancements, the release of a new Streets of Rage game seemed increasingly unlikely. However, like with many retro games, Sega fans' love for the Streets of Rage series never diminished. Various fan projects would pop up over time, further pronouncing this. One early example we have talked about on here before came out in 2003, a game known as Beats of Rage. Initially released by Senile Team, Beats of Rage is a fan tribute to Streets of Rage, replacing the original graphics and characters with resources taken from the King of Fighters series. The game, which was made just for fun, surprised its developers as over 1 million people downloaded and played it, a huge number considering the game wasn't even advertised and was discovered through word of mouth online only. This interesting game has a unique history which I may cover in more detail down the line, but today it's all about Streets of Rage Remake, a game that began development the same year Beats of Rage hit the internet. Speaking of 2003, while many people such as myself had already turned our attentions back to 8 and 16-bit consoles of our childhoods, we were unfortunately still in a period in history where the world of gaming was very much almost exclusively an ugly, bland 3D polygonal hell. So it's no surprise that Beats of Rage proved so popular, as this was around the time I and many others began to massively hunt for old games to fill our gaming needs. Considering all of this, the timing was perfect for Bomber Games to begin work on the Streets of Rage Remake fan project. So let's discuss the early development phase of this legendary fan project. Streets of Rage Remake was created by a Spanish developer who goes by the internet handle Bomberlink. Unlike many fan projects involving ROM hacking or using assets from other titles, Streets of Rage Remake was made completely from the ground up. To quote Bomberlink regarding this game, it does not use reverse engineering, nor a single line of code from the original games. It's all based on the visual interpretation. To put the scale of this undertaking into perspective, although work began on this game in 2003, it took 8 years to complete. Streets of Rage Remake was painstakingly created to include graphical improvements over the originals, completely new features not included in the original saga, fresh new scenarios, characters, remixed music, game modes, and even a store where players can unlock extras. But as impressive as these implementations are, these new features are just the tip of the iceberg. However, as massive and impressive as the results have been with this one, its creation hasn't arrived without big controversies. It's no secret that large corporate entities usually dislike it when fans infringe on their intellectual property, whether they profit from it or not. Nintendo, for example, is infamous for getting fan projects pulled and many fan games cancelled via simple cease and desist notices, often years before they get close to completed. While this may be the case, throughout history, Sega has generally taken a less conservative approach, in most cases allowing fan communities to experiment and go wild with their intellectual properties, including the iconic Sonic the Hedgehog. I think most of us would agree that being frivolously protective over copyright is sad, unnecessary, complete loser behaviour, and fan work for the most part only make brands even better. Take how Sega have handled Sonic the Hedgehog fan projects, for example. Sega in the past have been so impressed with fan efforts that they employed a fan project lead in the form of Christian Whitehead to direct Sonic Mania, a title some consider to be the greatest Sonic game released by Sega in many years. Without fan projects, Sonic Mania simply wouldn't have existed. But sadly, they didn't give Streets of Rage Remake the same leeway, and unfortunately, Sega took a different approach. After the game had been in development for 8 years, Bomberlink finally allowed it to be downloaded on PC in the year of 2011. Just days after its release on various downloads and torrent sites, Sega attempted to get the game pulled. Their first stop was on Bomberlink's own downloads. On the game's official forum, Bomberlink stated, "Sega has contacted me regarding the download posted on this site. While this issue is being resolved, please do not upload the game for others to download. Any links posted on this site will be removed." Wired.co.uk contacted Sega for a scoop on this situation, and Sega responded, stating, "Sega is committed to supporting any fans that take an interest in our games, and where possible, we do so by involving them in beta tests and other development marketing research opportunities. However, we need to protect our intellectual property rights, and this may result in us requesting that our fans remove online imagery, videos, or games in some instances." While companies are perfectly within their rights to do this, this scenario still came as a shock to Bomber Games, as the title's development had been no secret and heavily publicised online for 8 years. Sega had never before asked a fan to cease the creation of a project, so this all came as a big shock. Building on this story, according to the game's FAQ, Bomberlink's crew notified Sega of the game's development many years before its release, and Sega did absolutely nothing to prevent it. So this raises the question, why did this happen? Well, it is thought that Sega's sudden change of heart and protectionist behaviour around their IP was driven by the release of Streets of Rage 2 on iOS that same year. Conspiracy theorists have even gone one step beyond this too, believing the mobile release of such a game was a direct response to the traction Remake was gaining. Fortunately, while Sega were attempting to screw us all out of our entertainment, once a fan project is out in the wild, it's out in the wild. Once it's out there, there's little anyone can do about it, not even greedy, nasty Japanese businessmen. Now that we've covered some of the controversy surrounding this one's arrival, let's discuss more about the amazing game they tried to deprive us of. As mentioned right at the beginning of this video, this critically acclaimed fan project has received a major update since the last time I covered it. In my opinion, making it better than ever before. Released back in 2020, version 5.2 of the game marked a significant milestone in the evolution of this adventure. With approximately 300 additional bug fixes, tweaks, gameplay improvements and new features, this latest version offers a richer, more immersive experience than even previously. One of the most notable upgrades in version 5.2 is the inclusion of full 16:9 widescreen support, a feature that brings a new level of depth and clarity to the game's iconic environments. Whether navigating through the main game or delving into Streets of Rage Maker mods, the action is more vivid and engaging than ever. Building on the enhancements, the soundtrack has also received a substantial update, featuring 15 new tracks from BGM 1401. These additions include both remixes and original compositions, offering players a fresh auditory journey alongside the familiar rhythms of the past. The game's visual presentation was also overhauled, with new scenes and updated graphics permeating every aspect of the playthrough. From an all-new intro to enhanced endings, main menus and shop graphics, the aesthetic upgrades contribute to a more cohesive and polished narrative. The AI in the game has also seen significant improvements as well, offering more challenging and balanced gameplay. This refinement ensures that each encounter feels more strategic and rewarding. Moreover, version 5.2 introduces a new achievement system, motivating those who pick this up to explore every corner of the game. On top of all of this, the redesigned menu layout, complete with submenus and new options, enhances navigation and user experience. Players can also choose between the remixed or retro original soundtrack, allowing gamers to customize the soundtrack according to their preferences. Notably, new scenes such as the water fountain provide fresh settings that enrich Streets of Rage Remake's atmosphere, all in all providing us with more reasons than ever to appreciate this epic effort. As for the game's story, in this title, Mr. X maintains his role as the main antagonist, illustrated throughout the game's opening animation and text, establishing the basic story. Before Streets of Rage 4 burst onto the scene with the return of Adam and its rich lineup of playable characters, Streets of Rage Remake brought him back first. In fact, all 6 characters who starred in the original title appear once again, as well as the range of unlockable characters who we'll be discussing shortly. Away from a larger player selection from that of the originals, the story in this game is not linear, allowing players to choose from multiple different routes. The route chosen determines which level players can play through to eventually reach a showdown with Mr. X. This concept was briefly explored in Streets of Rage 3, where gamers play through different levels depending on their achievements in the last few stages. It's amazing to see this concept massively expanded upon here in this girthy fan serving. Long-term fans of the series will instantly notice that each route draws inspiration from the original trilogy, but it has all been remixed and rebuilt into something that feels fresh and new, yet at the same time nostalgic. In terms of other new features, the game includes bright and bold colours, just like all of the previous official installments in the series. However, unlike the official games, this installment includes the option to display blood in combat, making this entry a little more gritty for those who are into that sort of thing. For those who prefer a more traditional experience, lucky for them, there is an option to turn this feature off. However, the ability to toggle blood is just the beginning of the game's rich customizability. In an act of awesomeness, players can switch between bare knuckle and Streets of Rage themes, apply filters like scan lines, adjust transparency and more. The game includes all sorts of bells and whistles to let you experience this game in the best way that suits your tastes. Speaking of the epic customization options, even the gameplay itself is completely customizable, allowing players to tune their playthrough to match their preferred playstyle. Think of this as similar to the groove system in the Capcom vs SNK games, but with even more options at your disposal. Players can choose the difficulty setting, the number of lives they start with, whether players can damage each other in combat, and more. There really is a wealth of different choices to experiment with. As for the combat, it offers a range of possibilities too, including different jump types, meter types, combo types, weapon types, and even the combos themselves. Luckily for those looking for something more straightforward, the game has default options, making it easy to jump into the game without feeling overwhelmed by choice. While one could argue that all the customization could upset the game's balance, this experience is more about fan service and celebrating the franchise's history rather than prioritising anything else. The game can be set up however you like. As one would hope, with a title that proclaims itself to be a remake, the game still features many gameplay elements harking back to its predecessors. It contains various enemies from the previous installments and mixes in a few new ones to deliver a fresh yet familiar feel. When it comes to playing this one, like in all Streets of Rage games, practice makes perfect, and these villains can be disposed of through memorising patterns and footwork techniques. The enemies are scattered across the game's many branching paths, offering an absurd amount of replayability. The branching nature of the game has a number of advantages, as apart from providing a challenge, the paths lead to a huge amount of different endings for the player to discover. Whether a player survives or not exploring one of these routes, points are awarded that can be spent in the game shop. Here, of course, various unlockable content is made available. In my opinion, this feature arguably makes Streets of Rage Remake even more playable than any of the official entries, with a range of fantastic unlockables available to find years before Streets of Rage 4 even hit the market. I must add that some of these unlockables are absolutely insane, and amongst the extra content, even a new set of play modes can be found, such as a boss rush mode and a survival one. Adding to the fun, there are also silly GoldenEye style cheats that can be unlocked, such as giving characters the ability to fight with freaking lightsabers, for example. The rest of these unlockables offer up even more characters to control, including hidden characters from Streets of Rage 3, like Roo the Kangaroo, Shiva, one of the game's villains, and even the infamous Ash, who was banned from the international version of Streets of Rage 3 due to concerns over him being too gay.
I've never come over a little queer.
So it's amusing to see the same burly bear back in the game whom the cowards who made Streets of Rage 4 were too afraid to include. But if you're looking for something beyond simply a bit gay, the unlockable characters don't stop there. Amazingly, Streets of Rage Remake includes a few characters who had never been playable in the franchise before, such as the game's main villain Mr. X, who wields a machine gun, an alluring dominatrix named Ellie based on the Electra sprite from the previous games, and Rudra, a completely new character created from scratch for this title. You can play as all of these characters and more in this ultimate Streets of Rage experience. As one would expect, each of these characters is selectable during cooperative play, but what else is cool is that another first for the Streets of Rage series is that the game also includes cooperative play where the CPU controls the second player. Like everything else in the game, the CPU player's playstyle is also customizable, offering up even more choices, which seems to be what this game is all about. There is so much to do in this one and to tinker with. Just to further give you an idea of the sheer size and scale of this game, there are 103 different phases to play through. However, as we know, Streets of Rage is about more than level design itself, and no Streets of Rage video would be complete without talking about the music. Most would agree that composer Yuzo Koshiro's music within the Streets of Rage Trilogy is considered some of the best ever found within a video game. Epically, the soundtrack of this remake features fantastic remixes and rearrangements of some of Koshiro's best ever work. As illustrated hopefully throughout this video, the brilliant reworking of the game's music is a joy to the ears. And it was fantastically created by Gecko Yamori, Kali and BGM coders who all did a fantastic job here. Going back to the game's aesthetics, most would feel that the graphics are probably a slight step up from what the 16-bit Mega Drive would have been capable of, but it still feels in line with the classic series. This, in fact, makes me wish someone would find a way to port this game to the bloody Sega Saturn, as it would certainly make a fine addition to that platform's library. The same goes for Sonic Mania 2 actually. While we've already covered many elements of this feature-rich game, let's talk about another. One more unlockable fixture in this game is the Streets of Rage Maker feature. This mode allows users to create, edit and design their own levels with a maximum of 8 levels and 16 scenes in each. For designing scenes, many fans recommend using the FPG Edit program from the company Codemasters when doing this. Though if this doesn't sound like something for you, you can download mods made by fans, thus increasing the game's appeal perhaps further. The Maker feature of this game has certainly resulted in even more great fan projects. There is just so much to enjoy and be awestruck by when experiencing this game. As for the level of detail put in, it's truly tremendous. Take for example the fact that this game includes 64 artificial intelligence modules for CPU controlled characters, improved collision and damage data, improved animation and improved cartwheel and grip systems. This is way more than a simple remake. There is now also autosave functionality, extended actions to suit 6-button controls, the addition of weapon specials and the return of the police call originally seen in the first Streets of Rage game but dropped in later installments. The game is deeply extensive in what it offers players and is perhaps the most impressive fan project ever undertaken. In fact, calling the game a Streets of Rage Remake is slightly misleading and does not give this project the full credit it deserves. Remakes like those found in the Super Mario All-Stars pack feature the same gameplay with completely remade graphics, certainly making those games remakes of older ones, but the same description cannot be affixed to this title. Streets of Rage Remake, on the other hand, is more of a full reboot or reimagining of the older games rather than something that has simply been remade. It is not at all fair to refer to this title as a remake, because no title like this has ever existed before. This is an almost completely new experience, simply with callbacks to older games. Thus meaning, this whole scenario reminds me that I am still triggered by the fact that in 2020, Square Enix released a game titled Final Fantasy VII Remake, when that too was completely different from the entry we received in the 90s. Remake was a full-on reboot. What is it with developers not knowing the difference between the words remake, reboot and remaster? They all clearly mean very different things, and reboots take the most work, so devs should wear such labels with a badge of honour in my opinion. But regardless of how you label this game, there is no denying how fantastic it is. The game really is that special, and in my opinion, arguably the ultimate Streets of Rage game in existence at this point. Just wow. With it very much looking like the Streets of Rage franchise was long dead and buried, most series fans had come to the conclusion that it was in their best interest to look at the ambitious fan project known as Streets of Rage Remake as the closest thing they were ever going to get to a full Streets of Rage entry. Everything would, however, one day change when a series of fortunate events would unfold that would eventually lead to Streets of Rage 4 becoming a reality. But how did this long fantasy held by many actually come true? Well, to understand why Streets of Rage 4 was published, we first have to briefly look at a game that was developed by those who worked on the full Streets of Rage prior to making the modern beat-em-up classic, and that game is the remake of Wonder Boy: The Dragon's Trap. This lovingly well-crafted title was handled by the development house known as Lizardcube. Here, programmer Omar Cornut and artist Ben Fike reverse-engineered the Master System code, which would leave them to work with Wonder Boy 3's original game designer Ryuichi Nishizawa in producing a remake of the beloved original game. The team single-handedly and painstakingly reproduced all of the game's original art and animation, depicting it in a modern art style. The whole feat was extremely impressive, leaving gamers to wonder what Lizardcube would be up to next. Whilst this Wonder Boy title was developed by Lizardcube, the game was actually published by a fellow French company known as Dotemu. According to their website, their mission statement is as follows. Dotemu is a French video game company specialising in modern releases of beloved retro games. Our mission is simple: give every gamer access to yesteryear's classic video games on today's platforms, including PC, mobile, console and more. Working alongside the world's most cherished and recognised publishers, the Dotemu team has published a number of global top sellers across both PC and console, including Wonder Boy: The Dragon's Trap, Windjammers, several games in the Yeast series, and more. Founded in 2007, Dotemu leverages its considerable technological know-how to maintain the original spirit of classic games, while giving them a second life as rediscovered gems for a new generation of gamers. The critical response to Wonder Boy 3, The Dragon's Trap, and what Lizardcube and Dotemu managed to impressively do with such an old license was enough to earn Sega's trust to allow them to develop a Streets of Rage 4, a title that many had proposed but been rejected to make in the past. The collaborative effort between Lizardcube and Dotemu would also be aided by a company known as Guard Crush Games, who oversaw the gameplay elements of this brand new beat-em-up. They were chosen to partake in the project due to their passion for classic beat-em-ups and side-scrolling titles. The team at the time were best known for their Xbox 360 release Streets of Fury and follow-up on the PC Streets of Rage Fury Extended Edition. Streets of Fury revelled in over-the-top action and captured the studio's love for fun side-scrolling brawlers. These combined forces created the perfect recipe to make Streets of Rage 4 the special game fans desired. But before we can discuss what was delivered, let's first touch more on this historic title's development process. When it came to sculpting the title, the game's artists had a tall challenge to take on, and that was to come up with artwork which they felt would best represent the Streets of Rage series in 2020. This job was overseen by Lizardcube's art director Ben Fike and lead background artist Julian Nguyen Yu. Benfica states that after Wonder Boy The Dragon's Trap, which we did in association with Dotemu, we wanted to bring back some games that we really liked, and for me, Streets of Rage, which was a Sega license, and which I particularly liked, came to mind right away. Artistically speaking, in Streets of Rage, there were lots of things which are ingrained, like the urban feel, the neon, the bricks, and the ground. Those have really stayed strong in our memories, and I think it has always been an underlying inspiration. As soon as you think of characters fighting in the streets, very quickly we have had the idea of showing the story and the characters at a later time. The story takes place 10 years after Streets of Rage 3. Because the fans who have been waiting for this sequel for a long time, they've gotten older, have grown up, and the whole thing with these young, fiery kids in the streets wasn't working any longer with the way the fans are now. For a lot of people, the first level ties in with that Streets of Rage feeling you used to have, because I think that's the level where you spent the most time. Julian Nguyen Yu adds in relation to this stage, that is where players spend the most time. Also, that's where they tried things. They added a corner which was very difficult to do at the time. We tried to pay homage to that infrastructure of the first level in level 1 of Streets of Rage 4. Benfica adds the way we thought of it was really as a tribute, in particular to Streets of Rage 2, with that street corner with the car that crashes into the wall, which was something they wanted to do and was in the game design documents of the original game, and that they weren't actually able to do because of technical limitations. So here we wanted to pay homage to all of that. In regards to the character designs, Ben mentions that if you look at the original blueprints of the character designs from the 90s, the developers were forced to use pixel art due to limitations of the period. Whereas now, they could represent the characters in the game in the original manga art style that developers would have originally opted for if the technology was there. The use of heavy black lines around the characters also pays homage to the originals of paper character designs. Ben also comments on what it was like working on a game with such high expectations, adding that this is a game which holds a special place in a lot of fans' hearts, and there's a fine line between pleasing people and creating something new. The thing that I'm very happy about is that the fans thanked us a lot, and there was a huge number of fans who are delighted to have new Streets of Rage and a new game which seems to them to be very high quality. The game's main designer was a gentleman known as Jordi Asensio. Jordi was an early active member in the fighting game community, who as a result was also drawn to beat-em-ups with a particular special love for Guardian heroes. Speaking on Streets of Rage 4, he mentions that making a sequel is one of the hardest things to do. You must first figure out what was so good about the original games. Jordi views Streets of Rage 2 as the ultimate entry in the Streets of Rage series, so he chose to design the gameplay featured in Streets of Rage 4 around the second entry. In fact, he even states that he played both games side by side and tried to control both of them simultaneously to make sure he could match them in terms of the rhythm and feeling. Nowadays, we have a really mechanical idea of what game design must be. It has to be really precise, but this is just one part of the job. Another point is that game design is a way of consuming the content of the game. He states that the game's feel and level of ease it was to work on was hugely helped by Guard Crush Games' fantastic engine he was provided with to work on. Head of programming Cyril Lagarigu mentions that the engine was based off of one previously used when they released Streets of Fury on the Xbox 360. They would improve it a lot though for Streets of Rage 4. Jordi claims that we discussed every possible question about beat-em-ups. We also analysed fighting games frame by frame to understand which tools we needed exactly. We tried to rebuild it all. We tried to think like the game makers from that time, and with the modern technology that we have nowadays, we tried to create a tool which allowed us to develop this type of game on a top level. He goes on to add that when you create a sequel of a game, you shouldn't be overexcited. The common mistake is trying to add today's trends. You don't need to implement RPG mechanics, you don't want to over-modernize the game. You need to understand frustrations of that time and to figure out if these frustrations were due to technical limitations or idea limitations. In regards to working on such a huge project, Jordi rounds off with, at the beginning, you don't realise the pressure because you're working on the game of your dreams, so you are very motivated. And then, after the first announcement, when you start showing things, the fans begin to react in every sense of the word. On one hand, it motivates you because some find it really cool, but on the other hand, people criticise you quite harshly. But you must accept that because there are always reasons behind criticism. It's very important to look at what people do and say, even if sometimes it hurts, and to analyse where this feeling comes from. Meanwhile, the pressure gets harder, but since the game is good, it's fine. So now we have looked at both the creation of the game's art direction and the gameplay, but what about its music? One of the most standout features of previous Streets of Rage games. In regards to this, Olivier de Rivière was brought on board by Cyril Imbert as the game's main composer. He states that the idea was, we needed an artist who could do most of the music, but in a very special and modern way, but with the same spirit as was in the previous series. And that was when we started to think about Olivier de Rivière. Looking at his work, looking at everything he did in his different works in the past, so he can create something that gets the perfect fusion of gameplay and music. Streets of Rage is all about the fusion of gameplay and music. Playing Streets of Rage is like listening to an album, but an interactive album. Olivier de Rivière, in his new role, straight away decided he did not want to replicate the works of Yuzo Koshiro, because he felt he could not do a good job of replicating someone else's unique music on the basis that it would feel wrong to everybody. So it was not to be disrespectful, but also to let him have his own take as part of this project. Yuzo could inject his own flavour into Streets of Rage 4. Speaking of the return of Streets of Rage during the game's development, Yuzo Koshiro commented, "Streets of Rage came out on the Mega Drive. However, it wasn't that popular in Japan. It performed better in the United States and Europe. To be honest, I had pitched a sequel to the series a few times. However, Sega wasn't interested at the time. It was about 20 years ago. I find it interesting that a French team is working on it today. It is exciting to see a new modern day Streets of Rage game not coming from Japan, but from overseas. Motohiro Karashima and I used to work on the Streets of Rage series by ourselves. I'm interested to see the musical universe resulting from a collaboration between multiple artists. All of them obviously very talented musicians and composers, so I expect the result to be truly enjoyable sound." Amongst the many musicians working on the game, these included Shimomura, a former Capcom employee. In regards to her, Yuzo states, "I find it funny because Shimomura used to work on Street Fighter 2 originally. Sega's president at the time ordered that we do better than Street Fighter 2 with Streets of Rage. It is funny because this was our starting point when working on the game. I felt it is a strange turn of events that I end up working with Shimomura, who was working on that game at the time." Motohiro Karashima, another man who worked on the original trilogy's legendary soundtrack, adds, "Yuzo already completed 2 tracks. Back in the day, we were aiming at creating new sounds using the built-in systems of the 90s. Working now on Streets of Rage 4, I wondered whether pursuing new sounds was the right answer. Originally, we made what we wanted to make, which gave Streets of Rage. However, I realised that making what I want to make now wouldn't give the same results, which is why I felt a bit troubled. At the start, I listened back to the original Streets of Rage, wondering what made the essence of the game. I then came up with an answer. I felt that Streets of Rage wasn't based on melodies, it was phrases woven with each other, like paths knitted together. I wondered how to express that Streets of Rage sound, then worked on creating that universe with today's tools." Yuzo Koshiro continues the conversation by adding, "Originally the Streets of Rage music is heavily inspired by club music from the late 80s to early 90s. Working on the project today, I wondered about the approach to take, whether it should be modern using EDM for example. I thought about it, then came to the conclusion that I should be creating things that I wasn't able to make at the time. Also, looking at the fans' opinions on the internet, I saw many of them were expecting a sound close to the original. I thought that using the same original tools could be a good approach as well. I reused the old synths and drum machines of the time, re-recorded for sound, then made the song in a serious way. While working on Streets of Rage 4, I listened to the music that influenced me on Spotify and YouTube. I wanted to feel and regain what drove me at that time." According to Olivier de Rivière, the head composer himself, he states that each boss fight in the game consists of a different track, composed by different musicians, to make each fight feel more special. He also mentions that he and the other composers spent a lot of time working alongside the game's designers to work out their intentions throughout each intricate part of the game. This helped make the music more consistent with players' experiences. The music was designed so that it would increase players' adrenaline as they progressed through the stages. Olivier summarises in regards to working on the music that working on Streets of Rage 4 was the scariest thing he has ever done in his life, and it was frightening in every aspect. He said it was a huge honour, he did the best he could and hopes players enjoy it, but it is very difficult to come after such legendary composers, and as a result is very grateful to have been part of the whole project. So now we have looked in depth at how the game came to be, and all of its development cycle, I guess it's time to start discussing what players could find once in possession of this game. For the first time in an official Streets of Rage entry, Streets of Rage 4 offers up to 4-player cooperative play, which can be experienced locally. In fact, the game also allows for online play, another brand new element for the franchise. Like in Streets of Rage games of the past, the objective is simple. Players fight their way through stages, taking out wave after wave of enemies, raging through the streets in classic fashion. A lot of the usual features are back too, such as disposable weapons and items to pick up, which can be used to gain points or restore health. In addition to this, there are also stars that players can pick up, which relate to being able to execute a technique known as star moves, which we shall discuss more about in a moment. Players have the ability to perform standard attacks, throws, blitz moves or more powerful special attacks at the cost of a small portion of the user's health. In a new feature, it is possible to restore spent health on these special attacks by performing successive follow-up attacks without getting hit. The game features a nice counting system that records how many successful attacks you can land in a row, which gives you a little extra added motivation for not being hurt by your opponents. This new combo system also allows players to satisfyingly juggle opponents against walls and other players. In regards to the star moves, which can be performed by collecting the stars in each level, these are powerful attacks, a bit like the summoning of the police car in the series' original entry. The game's main gameplay mode is known as Story Mode, where players make their way through the story, fighting their way through 12 beautiful stages, each with their own unique boss encounter at the end of each gauntlet. How challenging this experience is depends on which difficulty setting players choose. There are 5 options in total, ranging from easy to mania, which dictate the experience players are delivered with. If you want to beat the game with little in the way of a competition, then easy mode is for you, but if you are a complete sadist, mania is there for all players if you want to attempt it. An interesting feature that this game has introduced is the title's lifetime score. This sees awarded points based on how much you challenge yourself, and after reaching each point milestone in the game's lifetime scoring system, new unlockables become available, giving the game not just an edge of replayability, but an extra incentive for you to challenge yourself more. This game is as much about the carrot as it is about the stick. Unlike the traditional Streets of Rage games of old, in Story Mode, which is a new feature in general, when a game over screen is reached, players can save the game and try every stage they are stuck on as many times as they like. Difficulty is determined not just by how tough the enemies are, but how many items are available, and also the amount of lives players start with at the beginning of each stage. Players have incentives to keep plugging away, and upon clearing each stage, ranks are given to the player based on how many points they could score, leading to the desire of playing the same stages over and over again. Away from the story mode, there is also an arcade mode, which plays more like the Streets of Rage games of old, where players must make their way through the entire game with a limited amount of lives. There is also a level select, so that players can practice whatever stage they like. A battle mode, which basically acts as a mini fighting game feature, where players fight against each other, and a boss rush mode to fight against the game's bosses. There are a lot of options here, and even an extra section which acts like a gallery for players to look at concept art and sprite designs. Nice. Now there is so much to address here. It is tough to do a video on a game that was 26 years in the making. We have a lot to get through today. This obviously includes the characters themselves. Initially, at the beginning of a playthrough, gamers have the choice of 4 different fighters, each of whom have their own unique moves, abilities and advantages control-wise. So let's cover who's featured in this game. First, we have Axel Stone from the original entry in the series. Due to the 10-year storyline gap between this game and Streets of Rage 3, he's depicted as older and more grizzled this time, featuring a massive beard. Classic character Blaze also makes a return to this game, not looking wildly different than before, but perhaps having much thicker legs and hips. Childbearing, in fact. The other two instantly selectable characters are brand new to the franchise. First, we have the heavyweight of the game, Floyd, a softly spoken, cybernetically enhanced apprentice of Dr. Zan, who was one of the playable fighters from the third entry in the series. And we have a young woman known as Cherry Hunter, who, as you can guess by her surname, is a relative of Adam Hunter, who was only previously playable in the first game in the series 33 years ago. The story soon reveals that Cherry is Adam's daughter, and speaking of Adam, he quickly becomes a selectable fighter too, and the game's first unlockable character. Playable fighters don't end here though, and pixel art versions from previous games can also be unlocked as players build up their lifetime score, both embracing and celebrating the franchise's storied history. While most of the previous game's characters are selectable in pixel form, I was disappointed that Rue and Ash weren't included. Instead, they were reduced to cameos, with Rue featuring behind the bar in one stage, and Ash appearing in the picture in the background whilst one of the boss fights takes place. Considering the push for modern DEI in games, I demand they bring Ash back this instant. Looking at the artwork in the game, I can fully appreciate how it is not for everyone, but at the same time I can also sympathise with the fact that the original Streets of Rage games only featured the pixel art style due to the extreme limitations technology provided artists with in the early 90s. So when you consider that the original Streets of Rage Trilogy were Japanese games, the manga sort of aesthetic that was given to this game makes a lot of sense. The only argument I place against this personally is that Streets of Rage was never that popular in Japan, and as I saw, was always more appealing to Westerners than it ever was to Easterners. So with this in mind, if I oversaw the production of this game, I would have certainly have ordered it to be produced with a more Western orientated art style, perhaps like the game was often depicted on its box art, but I am nitpicking at this point. I can see that it was a case of trying to reproduce the original artist's designs with a more modern flair. The stage design itself is both beautiful and varied, with a level of detail we obviously just did not get back in the day. The hand-drawn artwork is simply stunning, especially when paired with the multi-layered scrolling effects the game presents in its backgrounds. There is just so much to see and take in that I feel is going to take dozens upon dozens of playthroughs to ever truly fully appreciate. In terms of the game's enemy sprites, many of them appear to be redrawn versions of enemies of old, which helps give the game an additional layer of nostalgia for those who have been long-time fans, but at the same time enough polish to please those who have never played a game like this before. Like Streets of Rage of old, each of these levels have their own boss fights, each of which have their own unique attack patterns, which must be learned by players in order to be more easily defeated. Many of these boss fights take place against completely new opponents, whereas others take place against classic opponents of old. In fact, one of these opponents is even Max, a beloved playable character from Streets of Rage 2, who must be defeated here, but we will touch more on his appearance in the game very shortly. Something we have not touched upon really is this game's story, which revolves around another criminal organisation, this time known as the Y Syndicate, who even seem to have the police wrapped around their fingers. Speaking of this element, this brings another feature along with it. The game seems to contain two different types of enemy sprites, those who are members of the Y Syndicate and those who are in the police. These two types, although both hostile to the player, are also hostile and attack one another, an element I have not seen in a beat 'em up since Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, and certainly a feature I have never seen included in any of the Streets of Rage games previously. It unfolds in the story that the leaders of the Y Syndicate are a twin brother and sister, who are actually the son and daughter of Mr. X himself, which is why they are so hell-bent on getting revenge against the city. Again, just a personal gripe with regards to these two, they are not at all imposing like their father, but instead look anime as hell and simply look like selectable characters from a Persona game or something, rather than a title with a bit of early 90s attitude to it, like Streets of Rage. Once again, I am nitpicking here, but I feel they seem completely out of place in this environment. Speaking of Mr. X, he along with several other vintage bosses from the Streets of Rage series are accessible to fight against in pixel form. These fights are accessible via entering the secret areas and featuring the game as fantastic hidden Easter eggs, giving an even further nod to the franchise's awesome past. Now, we touched on the game's controls earlier and how they connected back to Streets of Rage 2, but what I have not mentioned is how they feel. The controls paired with the game's sound effects and combo system make Streets of Rage 4 feel like one of the most satisfying beat 'em up experiences I have ever had. It feels so good to pummel opponents, watching that count quickly mount up. Truly wonderful. A question I posed in the past was that I was doubtful that Streets of Rage 4 could live up to the fantastic fan game known as Streets of Rage Remake. However, from my findings, from my personal perspective at least, I can 100% confirm it absolutely does. Streets of Rage 4 is just so addictive. It's simply stupendous. While the base release of Streets of Rage 4 is excellent in its own right, in 2021, 1 year after its debut, the Mr. X's Nightmare DLC would see release that would expand on the game even further. Set after the events of Streets of Rage 4, the fight continues in Wood Oak City, with our heroes wanting to prepare themselves for future threats. Axel, Blaze and friends start some very deranged special training with the help of Dr. Zan of Streets of Rage 3 fame, who built an AR program from the remnants of Mr. X's brain that simulates every kind of danger they could be facing. The release of this DLC marked a significant milestone in the ongoing evolution of the title, a game that itself served as a revival of the iconic Streets of Rage series. This expansion not only enriches the game's narrative and aesthetic elements, but also introduces substantial gameplay enhancements that redefine the player's experience too, so let's touch on some of these glorious extra inclusions. A central feature of Mr. X's Nightmare is the introduction of 3 significant new playable characters, each with a distinct combat style and backstory. First, there's Estelle, previously encountered as a boss in the main game. Her transition from antagonist to playable character adds depth to the roster with her brute force and commanding presence. More to my taste, Max Thunder, a nostalgic addition from earlier series entries, brings raw power and wrestling technique that appeals to veteran players, and Shiva, also formerly an adversary, offers agility and swift flowing combos, creating a contrast in styles that enhances strategic choices in gameplay. Bearing in mind that both of these two fighters were previously playable in earlier installments, my predictions that they would one day be playable after appearing as boss characters in the base game would very much become a reality with Mr. X's Nightmare. Aside from getting to play as this trio, arguably the most engaging addition to this DLC is the survival mode. This mode challenges players to endure increasingly difficult waves of enemies, where each round introduces random power-ups and obstacles. The unpredictability and escalating difficulty of survival mode not only tests the player's adaptability and skill, but also significantly increases the replay value of the game. This mode serves as a perfect complement to the game's traditional linear storytelling by offering a dynamic arcade-like experience that varies with each session. It's jolly good fun. On top of all of this, Mr. X's Nightmare significantly expands the game's arsenal and movesets. New weapons like the Lightning Orb and Ghost Chaser add more tactical variety, allowing players to experiment with different approaches to combat. The inclusion of these elements encourages creativity and strategic planning, pushing players to develop new combinations and techniques tailored to their playstyle. Building on all of this further, the DLC also introduces a new layer of customization, permitting players to modify their favourite characters with alternate moves. This feature not only personalises the gameplay experience, but also encourages experimentation, making it possible to adjust characters for different tactical advantages. Additionally, the DLC includes enhanced animations and graphical improvements that refine the game's visual appeal, ensuring that the aesthetic evolution matches the gameplay depth. Music has always been a hallmark of the Streets of Rage series, and Mr. X's Nightmare continues this tradition with new tracks that complement the intense action. The soundtrack blends electronic beats with nostalgic motifs, capturing the essence of the urban combat narrative. Alongside the auditory enhancements, the DLC also enriches the game's environments and character designs, adding to the immersive experience. Mr. X's Nightmare DLC is not just an addition to Streets of Rage 4, but the perfect content that revitalises the entire game and makes it worth a revisit after a long break away from it. By introducing new characters, an innovative game mode, expanded weaponry and customization options, the DLC significantly broadens the scope and depth of the game. It enriches the player's experience by offering new challenges, strategic diversity and replayability, thus securing the game's place in the modern landscape of beat-em-ups. Through these enhancements, Mr. X's Nightmare does more than extend the life of Streets of Rage 4, it elevates the entire series to a new level, honouring its legacy while paving the way for future innovations even further. But that's enough about my thoughts for now. Let's have a look at what the major game publications made of this game on release. IGN would state Streets of Rage 4 is a faithful revival of the classic arcade beat-em-ups. Move from left to right, punch enemies, destroy objects for points, health and weapon pickups, punch a few more enemies and repeat. It's simple and unadorned, and while it expands modestly on combat with a few new skills to master, Streets of Rage 4 definitely prioritises nostalgia over any kind of big modern reinventions. Streets of Rage 4 delivers the greatest hits of a classic series, and is at its best when played with at least one friend. If the primary focus was delivering a traditional Streets of Rage experience with a modern coat of paint, it absolutely succeeds, but while it layers on a few new and interesting mechanics, it's still a very conservative update to the quarter-century-old format that feels like a slave to the past. So, as you can see, IGN would give this game a very average response, awarding the game a 7 out of 10. Heavily criticising the game due to a lack of reinvention and too much nostalgia reliance according to them. But as you know what they say, you can't spell ignorant without IGN. And I, on the other hand, could not feel that their statement is further from correct. As a man who has been looking at beat-em-ups on here for years, I can certainly confirm that this game does not present players with just a nostalgia trip. In fact, as I've mentioned earlier, the game adds enough that it very much feels like something new, and in fact, very little like what was available in the 90s. In my opinion, Streets of Rage 4 built on the old formula and modernises it for new players. The fact that the game features save states so that players are not expected to finish the game in one sitting, contains a boatload of achievements for repeat play, and features an easy mode so that players can beat the game in just over 1 hour, if they choose to do so, is enough reasons alone to suggest that the game is certainly not a nostalgia trip, but instead looking to cater to modern gaming habits. An arcade mode is present for those who do want an old school arcade experience, but the game certainly seems designed for everyone, rather than just us old boys. The game perfectly marries up some of the tropes of the classic beat-em-up genre with a modern art style, new play mechanics and a plethora of reasons to play through the same stages over and over. IGN would ignorantly add that beat-em-ups were simply about relentless challenge and pattern memorization. Let's be fair, there are clearly a lot more layers than that present here, and in the greats of old as well for that matter. So I am not quite sure what IGN was smoking when reviewing this high quality product. Destructoid summarised their findings too, adding that over 25 years since its last official entry, Streets of Rage is finally ready to make its long-awaited, highly anticipated return. The 16-bit era was an entire lifetime ago, and action games have advanced far beyond for traditional arcade brawlers of yore. Is there even a place for Blaze and crew in the modern gaming age? You bet there is, Jack. It's almost impossible to imagine a Streets of Rage devotee not being delighted with this sequel. It has the depth of combat and variance of character for dedicated fans to sink their teeth into, while at its chaotic, quick-fix action and co-op multiplayer offers even the most casual enthusiasts a solid experience. Streets of Rage 4's gratifying gameplay and fair price tag make this purchase worth anyone's cash. Streets of Rage 4 is an absolute triumph. It looks stunning, it sounds sublime, and it plays like a dream. Streets of Rage 4 delivers fistfuls of knockdown, drag-out action for fans old and new, all at a modest price. It's been a long wait for the Streets of Rage faithful, but comebacks rarely get much better than this. So at least we have one sensible take from a game journalist, I suppose. To see Streets of Rage 4 as merely a nostalgia trip like IGN did is ludicrous. Looking at the review scores across the board, the games received mostly critical love, with most big game publications falling into the same boat as myself and Destructoid. It was only a few rogues who didn't get the concept. Still, reflecting back on this game, now years after its release in its own right, it still gets a massive thumbs up from me, and I now trust Dotemu, Lizardcube and Guard Crush Games to bring me more great beat 'em ups in the future. If you have followed gaming news in the last 6 months, you will be aware that we have yet another new Streets of Rage game on the horizon, one of which I am terrified is going to be a bit rubbish. So subscribe and click here if you want to hear my take on that one. Cheerio!